Okay, I am back again, and we are here for our bookless classroom. So, in this classroom, we don't need any books, right? You can come here disheveled and disorganized. However, it's always a good idea to make sure that you have a pen and a piece of paper to write some things down. Remember what I say, and that is first of all, I'm a Dr. Annette Feravich. And because for 10 and older, um, call me doctor. For 10 and younger, whatever, Miss Annette is fine. Remember what I was saying yesterday is that when we engage our senses, then we are better able to learn something. Why? Because we're building numerous roads to that information. If I see something, I have one road. But if I write it down, I actually have two more roads. I've got a physical movement of my hand to write. I've got the visual of seeing what's on the paper as I'm writing. So there is a touch sensation that goes with it and a visual sensation that goes with it. So now I'm engaging more of my senses. The more senses that we engage, the more we are going to learn. So, and if you're distracted with something else, the less you're going to learn, right? You may be engaging your senses, but you're not engaging more of your senses for the material. You're engaging more of your senses that have to do with something else. They are actually dividing your attention, they're stealing your attention, right? So you may be using your senses, all five of your senses, but if you're using them for something else, you're obviously not learning the material either, right? Okay, so it's a good idea, even though you don't need a book for this class. It's a good idea to have a pen and a piece of paper to write down things that you might want to look up later on. Remember what I also said, and that is we are 3 days on, but we're 4 days off. And I don't want you coming back on Tuesday with your spirit depleted. I want you coming back on Tuesday being energized and wanting to learn more. Why? Because you didn't waste those 4 days off. You went and you built on what you learned in those 4 days off. I think that this is a great classroom, and I hope that more people aren't afraid to join me because I promise you, you're going to learn something, but you're also going to learn how to learn so that no matter where you go in life, and I know this is a middle school kind of a place that we're in right now, but this is going to help you so that no matter where you go in life, you know you can learn. One of the things about my oldest son is that he has gone to school for numerous things. He went to school for journalism, he went to school for accounting, and he completed these things to some degree, enough to get the knowledge, and then moved on to something else that he wanted to gain knowledge in. That's a wonderful thing, especially in this day and age, right? Where they are, making jobs so boring for us and so undesirable to go into work that we are having what the least we can possibly do on Mondays, whatever you call phone it in Mondays, whatever that's called, and nobody works on Fridays anymore. It's the reason why I have classes on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, right? So so get yourself engaged with this. I think it's a great way that we're going to be teaching Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then engaging in what we learn on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, right? Xfinity, what's up with my signal again? I'm getting a little bit tired of this. I pay an awful lot of money to not have a signal. I should be able to move around in my house and not have to worry about your signal, Xfinity. But if I were you, Xfinity, I would be checking in on the neighbors because I think that they are coming and they are interfering with my internet. So it may not be your fault, but I've had the sheriff's department out here, and apparently the sheriff's department doesn't care about what my neighbors are doing either. And we'll see if we even got that on camera. I really am trying. I'm sorry. I shouldn't do that because I know when there's big blanks that everyone's bored. Okay, so where did we leave off? We left off with this, and I said, you know, here's the book I'm using. It's a critical thinking book. I don't really think it's for everybody. It's for me because it explains this very first part, but I wouldn't spend my money on this critical thinking book unless you're a psychologist, and then it will work for you, okay? Because it's really critical thinking for, and it focuses on psychology. So if you recall, what we were talking about is we were talking about Bloom's taxonomy, right? And do you remember what a taxonomy is? A taxonomy, if you recall, we're going through the earlier lesson today that we had on vowels. That's where we... Yeah, we left off with who moved my cheese. We're not on critical thinking. What class am I in anyway? Day 2. Whoop, already out the window. Okay, no, who moved my cheese? That's where we're at. Thank God we're at middle school. I was like, what are we doing talking about analyzing in middle school for? No, we're talking about who moved my cheese. That's where we were at. And this story is getting good, isn't it? Right? And what I want you to think about, because this is where we're going with this, and I was really excited about this actually, and that's why I was a couple minutes late getting on, because I was getting a slide ready for you guys, a couple slides in fact, ready for you guys, even though I wasn't ready for the right class. Okay, so where were we? We had 4 characters. Sniff and Scurry were mice. And remember, they worked on instinct, didn't they? Right? So they're like, oh, we're not surprised there's no more cheese in Cheese Station C. And what's the big deal? We've got our gear ready. We just took our laced up that we had around our necks or hung up, right? Our laced up jogging suits and shoes and our jogging suits, and either Sniff or Scurry, it was probably Sniff, right? Went and put his nose up in the air and sniffed, and they were off to find more cheese without any worry at all about the fact that Cheese Station C was out of cheese. And in fact, they weren't surprised because they used their senses to notice. They were looking around and taking notes, right? They noticed that the supply of cheese was getting lower and lower, so they weren't surprised. Wow, Hem and Haw, they were just living the life, right? At Cheese Station C. They were getting up later. They were bringing their friends over. They were showing off their delicious Cheese Station C, like very rich cheese misers, right? So and then the cheese disappeared. And now we've got those two, like we have there, sweating about it, right? They are sweating about it. What are we going to do? What happened to our cheese? This isn't fair, right? That's what they were saying. This isn't fair. So let's pick up about where I'm going to repeat the last maybe paragraph or two. I remember I read this paragraph. I'm not sure exactly what other paragraphs I read. So let me get to the right pictures over here too, right? So we had them going through the maze, right? And looking for cheese. And we had the 2 mice, Sniff and Scurry, doing a good job using their senses, right? Remember, we're talking about using our 5 senses in order to learn and to discover. So that's what they were doing. They were using their senses. And then we have also Hem and Haw, who were kind of lounging around in Cheese Station C, enjoying the luxury of having so much cheese, right? And we had a couple sayings on the cheese, having cheese that they wrote on the walls, right? That's what they did. They wrote them on the walls. Having cheese makes you happy. And we saw one more. The more important your cheese is to you, the more you want to hold on to it. Oh, that's so interesting. The more important cheese is to you. And cheese actually is very important to me. So I totally get that. But maybe cheese isn't so important to you. right? But the more important it is to you, the more you want to hold on to it. So there's some wisdom here in Sniff and Scurry and Hem and Haw and Who Moved My Cheese by Dr. Spencer Johnson. Let's continue. So we're not continuing, we're repeating a little bit. Haw shut his eyes as tight as he could and put his hands over his ears. He just wanted to block everything out. He didn't want to know the cheese supply had gradually been getting smaller. He believed it had been moved all of a sudden. Convenient thinking, isn't it? Maybe not. Hem analyzed the situation over and over, and eventually his complicated brain with its huge belief system took hold. Why did they do this to me? He demanded. What's really going on here? Finally, Haw opened his eyes, looked around, and said, by the way, where are Sniff and Scurry? Do you think they know something we don't? Hem scoffed. What would they know? Hem continued, they're just mice. They just respond to what happens. We're little people. We're smarter than mice. We should be able to figure this out. I know we're smarter, Haw said, but we don't seem to be acting smarter at this moment. Things are changing around here, Hem. Maybe we need to change and do things differently. Okay, so that's really where we left off. Why should we change? Hem asked. We're little people. We're special. This sort of thing should not happen to us. Or if it does, we should at least get some benefits. Why should we get benefits? Haw asked. Because we're entitled, Hem claimed. Entitled to what? Haw wanted to know. We're entitled to our cheese. Why? Haw asked. Because we didn't cause the problem, Hem said. Somebody else did, and we should get something out of it. Haw suggested maybe we should simply stop analyzing the situation so much and go and find some new cheese. Oh no, Hem argued. I'm going to get to the bottom of this. While Hem and Haw were still trying to decide what to do, Sniff and Scurry were already well on their way. They went farther into the maze up and down corridors, looking for cheese in every cheese station they could find. They didn't think of anything else but finding new cheese. They didn't find any for some time until they finally went into an area of the maze where they had never been before, Cheese Station N. They squealed with delight. They found what they had been looking for, a great supply of new cheese. Let me make sure everything's going right over here as I'm reading. I always get like, ah. In the meantime, Hem and Haw were still back in Cheese Station C, evaluating their situation. They were now suffering from the effects of having no cheese. They were becoming frustrated and angry and were blaming each other for the situation they were in. Do you ever get that way when you're hungry? Do you ever get frustrated or angry or emotional or tired or crabby when you're hungry? I know I do. I don't get as crabby as some other people, though. Food isn't my thing that makes me crabby. What makes me crabby is when sheriff's departments don't do their job. That makes me crabby. Oh, another plug. Of course it would make me angry if police don't do their jobs, right? Of course it would. Or sheriffs. They're supposed to be our cowboys. Where are our cowboys? That's what I want to know. Okay, let's get back to Hem and Haw. What's going on over here? Now and then Haw thought about his mice friends, Sniff and Scurry, and wondered if they had found any cheese yet. He believed they might be having a hard time, as running through the maze usually involved some uncertainty. But he also knew that it was likely to only last for a while. I want to make sure I didn't leave anything out. Sometimes Haw would imagine Sniff and Scurry finding new cheese and enjoying it. He thought about how good it would be for him to be out on an adventure in the maze and to find fresh new cheese. He could almost taste it. Wow, so he's finding it, even the thought, kind of exciting to go on an adventure. The more clearly Haw saw the image of himself finding and enjoying the new cheese, the more he saw himself leaving Cheese Station C. "Let's go," he exclaimed all of a sudden. "No," Hem quickly responded. "I like it here. It's comfortable. It's what I know. Besides, it's dangerous out there." "No, it isn't," Haw argued. "We've run through many parts of the maze before, and we can do it again." "I'm getting too old for that," Hem said, "and I'm afraid I'm not interested in getting lost and making a fool of myself. Are you?" That's interesting, isn't it? So who is this? Hem is getting a little afraid, right? And maybe embarrassed that he might not know something. That's interesting. With that, Haw's fear of failing returned and his hope of finding new cheese faded. So it looks like Hem was influencing Haw to feel this way, right? So Hem was feeling bad and afraid, fearful. He didn't want to leave Cheese Station C because he was afraid now of the maze. And it seems like he is convincing Haw to be afraid again as well. That can happen, can't it? Sometimes we need to think about influencing our friends in positive ways, right? Instead of in making them afraid. That would be good if we did that. So every day the little people continued to do what they had done before. They went to Cheese Station C, found no cheese, and returned home, carrying their worries and frustrations with them. You know what I've heard before? I've heard a saying that says the definition of insanity is when you keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. It sounds like Hem and Haw are going to go insane, right? Because they keep going to Cheese Station C, but they expect different results. They keep doing the same thing, but they're expecting different results. Are you doing that? Are you doing the same thing over and over again, but you think that it's going to turn out differently? Are you not doing your homework over and over again and expecting somehow that it's going to turn out that you're smart? Right? Are you doing something over and over again? Are you aggravating your parents over and over again and expecting that it's going to turn out differently? Right? Are you going to school unprepared every day and expecting it to turn out differently? That is a definition of insanity, when you do the same thing over and over again, but you expect different results. That sounds like what Hem and Haw are doing to me. They tried to deny what was happening, but found it harder to get to sleep, had less energy the next day, and were becoming irritable. Like I said, they're not eating, they become irritable. Their homes were not the nurturing places they once were. The little people had difficulty sleeping and were having nightmares about not finding any cheese. That's so scary when we're stressed and we have nightmares, isn't it? But Hem and Haw still returned to Cheese Station C and waited there every day. Hem said, "You know, if we just work harder, we'll find nothing has really changed that much. The cheese is probably nearby. Maybe they just hid it behind the wall." The next day, Hem and Haw returned with tools. Hem held the chisel while Haw banged on the hammer until they made a hole in the wall of Cheese Station C. They peered inside, but found no cheese. Well, at least they're trying to do something, right? This is something new that they're doing. They were disappointed but believed they could solve the problem. Well, that's good. They believe that they could solve the problem, so they have a belief inside of them. So they started earlier, stayed longer, and worked harder. But after a while, all they had was a large hole in the wall. Well, you keep looking in the same place and you didn't find any cheese. Maybe all your efforts aren't going to the right place. Maybe you have wasted efforts, right? Haw was beginning to realize the difference between activity and productivity. Oh, well, that's interesting. Activity, they were very active now, right? But they weren't producing anything. That's what it looks like. Maybe, Hem said, we should just sit here and see what happens. Sooner or later, they have to put the cheese back. Haw wanted to believe that, so each day he went home to rest and returned reluctantly with Hem to Cheese Station C. But Cheese never reappeared. By now, the little people were growing weak from hunger and stress. Haw was getting tired of just waiting for the situation to improve. He began to see that the longer they stayed in their Cheese Station C, the worse off they would be. Haw knew they were losing their edge. Finally, one day, Haw began laughing at himself. What do you think losing your edge means? What do you think that means? They were losing their edge. I wonder what that means. I think it kind of means that they were losing sort of who they are, right? Smart people, smart little people who problem solve and figure things out, right? I think that they were losing some of who they were. That's what maybe they were saying when they were losing their edge, right? Their spark, maybe their quick-wittedness, right? They were losing, they weren't as sharp. They weren't as sharp. That's an edge, right? You're losing your edge. The edge of a knife is sharp. They were losing their edge. Okay. Finally, one day, Haw began laughing at himself. I read that. Haw, 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 look at us. So he's laughing. Haw, haw, look at us. We keep doing the same thing over and over again and wonder why things don't get better. If wasn't so ridiculous, it would be even funnier. Haw did not like the idea of having to run through the maze again because he knew he would get lost and have no idea where he would find any cheese. But he had to laugh at his folly when he saw what his fear was doing to him. That's interesting. He had to laugh at his folly when he saw what his fear was doing to him. He asked him, "Where did we put our running shoes?" It took a long time to find them because they had put everything away when they found their cheese at Cheese Station C, thinking they wouldn't be needing them. As Hem saw his friend getting into his running gear, he said, "You're not really going out into the maze again, are you? Why don't you just wait here with me until they put the cheese back?" "Because you just don't get it," Haw said. "I didn't want to see it either, but now I realize they're never going to put yesterday's cheese back. It's time to find new cheese." Hem argued, "But what if there is no cheese out there? Or even if there is, what if you don't find it?" "I don't know," Haw said. He had asked himself those same questions too many times and felt the fears again that kept him where he was. He asked himself, "Where am I more likely to find cheese? Here or in the maze?" He painted a picture in his mind. He saw himself venturing out into the maze with a smile on his face. In psychology, we call that a mental representation. He put a mental representation of what he needed to do in his mind. That's how we reach our goals. We reach our goals by putting mental representations, big words, mental pictures. We picture it in our heads. I remember that I used to, when I was a little girl, picture in my head what I was going to look like and be when I grew up. And I always felt that I was going to be a professional person. And so I always pictured myself in a professional suit with a briefcase. And guess what I looked like when I first started my first jobs? I wore professional looking suits, kind of, as much as I could afford, because I couldn't afford suits at that time. I was pretty poor. But I did get a briefcase. That was one of the first gifts that my husband gave me, was a briefcase. And so I had, since I was a little girl, a mental representation in my head of what I wanted to look like. And that is what your body and your mind work towards when you put that mental picture in your head. We know that people who grew up in the inner city, for example, and have been surrounded by violent crime, for example, and have had many relatives who were in jail, for example, they often have a mental representation of their lives being exactly the same, of not getting any work, of getting themselves in trouble, of being violent, and eventually ending up in jail. Our mental pictures that we have in our heads are so important because our bodies, our minds, and our spirits move in the direction of a mental picture. And so that is what Haw is doing. He's painting a mental picture of himself enjoying going through the maze, right? There are a lot of things that we might be afraid to try, but maybe sometimes deep in our hearts, we really do want to try those things. Well, the best way to see if we could do that is to put a mental picture in our mind of us actually doing that. Okay? That's a really good idea. All right, so that's what Haw did. He painted a mental picture in his mind. While this picture surprised him, it made him feel good. He saw himself getting lost now. He saw himself getting lost now and then in the maze, but felt confident he would eventually find new cheese out there and all the good things that came with it. He gathered his courage. Oh, that's so good. He gathered courage, is what he did. By putting these mental representations in his head, these mental pictures in his mind, he was getting positive feelings because of it. We know that's brain chemistry activating. That's what that is. Then he used his imagination to paint the most believable picture he could, with the most realistic details of him finding and enjoying the taste of new cheese. This is how we really make our mental pictures in our heads come to life. We see ourselves doing it, right? We get every detail of us doing the activity. And the more details that we have in our heads of doing that activity, the more likely we are to complete the activity. Wow, how easy is that? Put a picture in my head and it makes it easier for me to do the task. Well, that's pretty easy for me to put a picture of my head in my head of succeeding, right? Woo, I could put a picture in my head of succeeding. The interesting thing here, though, is that I know as a psychologist is that you can't just put a positive cross the finish line picture in your head. You actually have to picture yourself doing it as well, which is what Haw is doing. He's detailing every event in his head of him going through the maze, getting lost, getting frustrated sometimes, and yet still finding cheese. Every detail of his journey. He's pretty smart. He saw himself eating Swiss cheese with holes in it, bright orange cheddar and American cheese, Italian mozzarella, and wonderfully soft French camembert cheese. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. And then he heard him say something and realized they were still at Cheese Station C. Haw said sometimes things change and they are never the same again. This looks like one of those times. That's life. Life moves on. And so should we. I think that that's so important, right? Especially now. You know, we might not have liked what went on during COVID, but life, that's life. Life moves on. And so should we. Very wise words by Haw. Haw looked at his emaciated companion. Emaciated. What is emaciated? We have, and I was talking in early bird classroom about the stops. The stops. Emaciated. 5 stops in that word. 5 stops. We'll be talking more about those as we go along. But we like to teach a lot of things. Emaciated. 5 stops in that word. What does that mean? Emaciated. He looked at his emaciated, what did he call him? Companion. His emaciated companion. What is that? It means look it up. And look it up. But I'll tell you, it means he was getting really thin. So his face was all drawn in, right? Kind of looking like Skeletor, right? That's emaciated. I don't know any new characters, so sorry if you don't know who the Skeletor is. I don't really either. But I can imagine him in my mind's eye, right? I can make a mental representation of Skeletor in my mind. He looks something like this, right? Haw looked at his emaciated companion and tried to talk sense to him, but Hem's fear had turned into anger and he wouldn't listen. Did that ever happen to you? Have you ever had a time where you were so afraid that you started getting mad that nobody would do anything for you? I have. Because you know what? I've had problems over here and I've called the sheriff's department and the sheriff's department's not doing anything. And that makes me afraid. It does. It makes me afraid. And now I'm not sure what I am supposed to do. Kind of like Hem and Haw, right? So that kind of made me mad. It kind of made me mad because when I'm afraid over here, afraid enough that I call the police and then, or the sheriff, actually, I'm thinking I'm going to get a cowboy over here and I get somebody who's like a frightened little chicken over here. I know. So we all have issues and we all get frustrated, but I'm going to have to figure out what I'm going to do about the problem. That's what we all do. All of us face problems. And when I don't have somebody coming in to solve the problem, well, I guess who's going to have to solve the problem? I guess I'm going to have to solve the problem. And that doesn't mean I'm taking the law into my own hands because that wouldn't be wise now, would it? So I wouldn't want somebody reading something into what I'm saying. That would be inappropriate. So now Hem is getting angry. His fear is turning to anger. Haw didn't mean to be rude to his friend, but he had to laugh at how silly they both looked. As Haw prepared to leave, he started to feel more alive. He's feeling alive because he's getting engaged in life again. Knowing that he was finally able to laugh at himself, let go and move on. Haw laughed and announced, "It's maze time." Hem didn't laugh and didn't respond. Haw picked up a small, sharp rock and wrote a serious thought on the wall for Hem to think about. As was custom, Haw even drew a picture of cheese around it, hoping it would help Hem to smile, lighten up, and go after new cheese. But Hem didn't want to see it. It read, "If you do not change, you can become extinct." Let me say that again. If you do not change, you can become extinct, right? That's what we're finding. We have to find new ways to solve our problems because the old ways don't seem to be working right now. And if we don't find new ways to solve our problems, what will happen? We will become emaciated. Right? We might become extinct. Wow, right? Then Haw, who knew this was going to be so serious with cheese and little people? Then Haw stuck his head out and peered anxiously into the maze. He thought about how he'd gotten himself into his cheeseless situation. He had believed that there may not be any cheese in the maze, or he may not find it. Such fearful beliefs were immobilizing and killing him. Immobilizing. So maybe that's why they become extinct, right? Immobilizing is killing him. Immobilizing. Another 5 stops in that word. 5 stops. Immobilizing. What does that mean? What does immobilizing mean? Immobilizing means that he couldn't do anything. He was frozen is what immobilizing means. To be immobilized, I can't move. He's frozen, and he's frozen with fear. So, and that fear, right? Because such fearful beliefs were immobilizing and what? Killing him. If we were frozen with fear, we couldn't do anything, right? If we were frozen with fear, we couldn't do anything. And if we couldn't do anything, I couldn't go shopping for food, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. How many people are having some of those same kinds of feelings? And how often are we having them, right? Haw smiled. He knew Hem was wondering. He knew Hem was wondering what? About becoming extinct? Who moved my cheese? But Haw was wondering, why didn't I get up and move with the cheese sooner? As he started out into the maze, Haw looked back to where he had come from and felt its comfort. He could feel himself being drawn back into familiar territory, even though he hadn't found cheese here for some time. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting how we can become so comfortable with what we're doing? So we get up every day, we play video games, we eat cereal, we take a nap, we play some more video games, we text, we scroll through our phones and information. None of that sounds exciting. None of that sounds interesting at all, right? And so but we're drawn back to it, right? But we're drawn sometimes back to the comfort of. Sometimes we have friends who don't treat us very nicely, but the next day when we come back to class, we don't know who else to sit with. And so what do? We go back to where we're comfortable, right? Even though maybe that person wasn't very nice to us. Why are we drawn back? Because we're used to it, right? So Haw was being drawn back to Cheese Station C because that's what he was so used to. I'm so used to doing it this way. I don't know if I could do it another way. That seems like what they're feeling, doesn't it? Let's see. Haw became more anxious and wondered if he really wanted to go out into the maze. He wrote a saying on the wall ahead of him and stared at it for some time. So here now Haw is writing phrases for him. He wrote this one for him, right? If you do not change, you will become extinct. But this one he wrote for him. What would you do if you weren't afraid? If I were you, I might take a picture of that and print that out and put that on my wall right there. I think that's a great picture. In fact, I'm going to blow it up for you to be able to take a picture of it and then print it out and put it on your wall. And maybe read that every single day to yourself. What would you do if you weren't afraid? What would you do if you weren't afraid? You know what I did? I started these classes. With nobody coming to my class, I started these classes. That's what I did when I wasn't afraid, right? And I might fail. I might fail at it. Maybe nobody will ever come to my classes. And maybe I'm going to have to change and do something new with my classes, right? I mean, I'm doing something new by starting these classes. Maybe I'll have to do something new a little bit later on. But that's what I did because I wasn't afraid to try. I wasn't afraid to try it. So good. He thought about it. He knew sometimes some fear can be good. When you are afraid things are going to get worse if you don't do something, it can prompt you into action. It can make you do something, right? If you're afraid, maybe that fear is going to help you to do something. But it is not good when you are so afraid that it keeps you from doing anything. And isn't that what happened to Hem and Haw? They were so afraid they couldn't do anything. He looked to his right to the part of the maze where he had never been and felt fear. Then he took a deep breath, turned right into the maze, and jogged slowly into the unknown. So see what he did when he was afraid? And again, I'm going to steal from Bill Maher, the Batman analogy. What did Batman do when he was so afraid of bats? He became a bat is what he did. What did Haw do when he was afraid to turn to the right because he'd never been there? He didn't turn to the left. He turned to the right is what he did, didn't he? He ran straight into his fear. Don't expect somebody to remove your fear, because even if somebody does remove it, it's going to be there later on, and that person might not be around to remove the fear again. Then what are you going to do? Then what are you going to do, right? Sometimes fear is good, and sometimes we're supposed to be afraid of things that are going to hurt us, of course. Deciding what is good for us and what is bad for us is part of what we're learning here. Some things are bad for us, and we need to recognize that. They might be good for somebody else. It doesn't mean they're bad, right? Maybe I'm allergic to cheese. Maybe I'm allergic to cheese. So it's bad for me. But it doesn't mean it's bad for everybody, and it doesn't mean cheese is bad. Just because cheese is bad for me, and it's not, because I love cheese, thank goodness. But if it is bad for me, it doesn't mean cheese is bad. It just means it's bad for me. So we're not making a judgment that things are bad. We're just saying it's bad for me for whatever reason, right? Okay. As he tried to find his way, Haw worried at first that he might have waited too long in Cheese Station C. He hadn't had any cheese for so long that he was now weak. It took him longer, and it was more painful than usual to get through the maze. He decided that if he ever got the chance again, he would get out of his comfort zone and adapt to change sooner. It would make things easier. Then Haw smiled a weak smile as he thought, better late than never. During the next several days, Haw found a little cheese here and there, but nothing that lasted very long. But at least he's getting his strength back, right? At least a little bit. He had hoped to find enough cheese to take some back to him and encourage him to come out into the maze. But Haw didn't feel confident enough yet. He had to admit he found it confusing in the maze. Things seemed to have changed since the last time he was out here. Just when he thought he was getting ahead, he would get lost in the corridors. It seemed his progress was 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. Do you ever feel that way? Let's think about that for a minute. What does that mean? 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards. It means I'm really slowly making progress. I am making progress though, right? Because for every 2 steps, I only take 1. Because I take 1 backwards, right? Okay, so, but I'm still making progress, so that's good. It was a challenge, but he had to admit that being back in the maze, hunting for cheese, wasn't nearly as bad as he feared it might be. Well, that's good. A lot of times that happens, I found, is that when we face our fears kind of disappear is what ends up happening. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes. As time went on, he began to wonder if it was realistic for him to expect to find new cheese. He wondered if he had bitten off more than he could chew. That's another phrase too. A lot of times we want to think about these phrases instead of just passing them by. What do they really mean? He bit off more than he could chew, right? Well, what would happen? What would happen? That would be dangerous, wouldn't it? If I took a big giant bite of cheese and I couldn't chew it, what would happen? I would choke. That's what would happen. I would choke. And isn't that interesting? What happens when people choke? They become immobilized. Immobilized. They become immobilized when I choke, right? What if I'm in a competition and I choke? I become immobilized, don't I? I become frozen. I can't move. Okay. Let's see where I was. Whenever he started to get discouraged, he reminded himself that what he was doing, as uncomfortable as it was at the moment, was in reality much better than staying in the cheeseless situation. I was going to say cheese station C. Cheeseless situation. He was taking control rather than simply letting things happen to him. He was taking control rather than letting things happen to him. When we let things happen to us, we call that being a victim. We are being a victim when we let things just happen to us and we don't take control. So that's a really good feeling when we feel like we can take control, that we can have our lives go in this direction if we want, or that direction. That's taking control of our lives. So that's good. Then he reminded himself if Sniff and Scurry could move on, so could he. Hello, they were just mice. Later, as Hall looked back on things, he realized that the cheese at Cheese Station C had not just disappeared overnight, as he had once believed. So now his thinking is changing as well. The amount of cheese that had been there towards the end had been getting smaller, and what was left had grown old. It didn't taste as good. Mold may even have begun to grow on the old cheese, although he hadn't noticed it. He had to admit, however, that if he had wanted to, he probably could have seen what was coming, but he didn't. Are there times that you can see what is coming, but you don't prepare for it? Are there? Of course. We all do it, of course. But once we realize it, no reason being afraid. We just got to start preparing, right? Not a day is gained from worry, right? Not one single day is gained from worry. Haw now realized that the change probably would not have taken him by surprise if he had been watching what was happening all along, and if he had anticipated change, if he had predicted it, if he expected it. That's what anticipated means. So, if he had been using his senses, right, instead of analyzing a little bit more, using his eyesight, using his sense of smell to notice that the cheese was getting moldy, right? Those discussing the issue with him, those probably would have helped him anticipate. 4 stops in that word, 4 stops. Anticipate or expect that this was going to happen. Maybe that's what Sniff and Scurry had been doing. He decided he would stay more alert from now on. He would expect change to happen and look for it. Well, that's pretty good then. Then I'm ready for it if I'm looking for it. He would trust his basic instincts to sense when change was going to occur and be ready to adapt to it. And remember, our basic instincts are those 5 instincts, right? So sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, right? Our 5 senses, right? So that's what he was saying. I'll use my 5. And there was also taste in there. They were tasting the cheese and it was moldy. They could smell the mold on the cheese. They could hear or see Sniff and Scurry had disappeared, right? So those are basic, using our basic senses, we can tell when change is coming. He stopped for a rest and wrote on the wall of the maze. What's he going to write this time? Smell the cheese often so you know when it is getting old. Well, there you go. Smell the cheese often. Smell the cheese often. I'm not eating any cheese. What does that even mean for me? Think about that. What does that even mean for you? He stopped for a rest and wrote, we already read that. Sometime later, after not finding cheese for what seemed like a long time, Haw finally came across a huge cheese station, which looked promising. When he went inside, however, he was most disappointed to discover that the cheese station was empty. This empty feeling has happened to me too often, he thought. He felt like giving up. Haw was losing his physical strength. He knew he was lost, and he was afraid he would not survive. And so now he's thinking he might die. He thought about turning around and heading back to Cheese Station C, where he kind of felt comfortable, right? At least if he made it back and Hem was still there, Haw wouldn't be alone. So that's kind of what we want to do when we get afraid as well. Find our friends, don't we? Then he asked himself the same question again. What would I do if I weren't afraid? What would I do if I weren't afraid? Haw thought he was past his fear, but he was afraid more often than he liked to admit, even to himself. He wasn't always sure what he was afraid of, but in his weakened condition, he knew now he was simply fearful of going on alone. Haw didn't know it, but he was running behind because he was still weighed down by his fearful beliefs. Haw wondered if Hem had moved on or if he was still paralyzed by his own fears. Then Haw remembered the times when he had felt his best in the maze. It was when he was moving along. He wrote on the wall knowing it was as much a reminder to himself as it was a marking for his friend Hem, hopefully to follow. Oh, so now he's leaving a trail for his friend Hem, right? So what does this one say? It says, movement in a new direction yields you, yields. Oh, that's a glasses thing because that's not even close to yields. Let me read it over here. Movement in a new direction helps you find new cheese. So he moved in a new direction. He turned right instead of left, and that helped him find new cheese. Haw looked down the dark passageway and was aware of his fear. What lay ahead? Was it empty or worse? Were there dangers lurking? Were there dangers lurking? Not dangerous lurking. Were there dangers lurking? He began to imagine all kinds of frightening things that could happen to him. He was scaring himself to death. Then he laughed at himself. He realized his fears were making things worse. So he did what he would do if he weren't afraid. He moved in a new direction. What would you do if you weren't afraid? You'd probably move in a new direction. As he started running down the dark corridor, he began to smile. Haw didn't realize it yet, but he was discovering what nourished his soul. What? Nourished his soul. He was letting go and trusting what lay ahead for him, even though he did not know exactly what it was. To his surprise, Haw started to enjoy himself more and more. Why do I feel so good? He wondered. I don't have any cheese, and I don't know where I am going. Before long, he knew why he felt good. He stopped to write on the wall again. When you stop being afraid, you feel good. Haw realized he had been held captive by his own fear. Moving in a new direction had freed him. Now he felt the cool breeze that was blowing in this part of the maze, and it was refreshing. He took in some deep breaths and felt invigorated by the movement. Once he had gotten past his fear, it turned out to be more enjoyable than he once believed it could even be. I had the even. Haw hadn't felt this way for a long time. He had almost forgotten how much fun it was to go for it. To make things even better, Haw started to paint a picture in his mind again. He saw himself in great realistic detail, sitting in the middle of a pile of all his favorite cheeses, from cheddar to brie. He saw himself eating the many cheeses he liked, and he enjoyed what he saw. Then he imagined how much he would enjoy all their great tastes. The more clearly he saw the image of himself enjoying new cheese, the more real and believable it became. He could sense that he was going to find it. He wrote, imagining yourself enjoying your new cheese leads you to it. That's kind of what I said, right? Putting a mental picture in your mind helps you get to your goal. Haw kept thinking about what he could do, what he could gain instead of what he was losing. He was thinking about what he was gaining instead of what he was losing. He wondered why he had always thought that a change would lead to something worse. Now he realized that change could lead to something better. Why didn't I believe this before? He asked himself. Then he raced through the maze with greater strength and agility. Before long, he spotted a cheese station that became excited as he noticed little pieces of new cheese near the entrance. They were types of cheese he had never seen before, but they looked great. He tried them and found that they were delicious. He ate most of the new cheese bits that were available and put a few in his pocket to have later and perhaps share with him. He began to regain his strength. He entered the cheese station with great excitement. But to his dismay, he found it was empty. Someone had already been there and had left only the few bits of new cheese. He realized that if he had moved sooner, he would very likely have found a good deal of new cheese here. Haw decided to go back and see if Hem was ready to join him. He retraced his steps. He stopped and wrote on the wall. The quicker you let go of old cheese, the sooner you find new cheese. After a while, Haw made his way back to Cheese Station C and found Hem. He offered Hem bits of new cheese, but was turned down. Hem appreciated his friend's gesture, but said, "I don't think I would like new cheese. It's not what I'm used to. I want my own cheese back, and I'm not going to change until I get what I want." Haw just shook his head in disappointment and reluctantly went back out on his own. As he returned to the farthest point he had reached in the maze, he missed his friend, but realized he liked what he was discovering. Even before he found what he hoped would be a great supply of new cheese, if ever, he knew that what made him happy wasn't just having cheese. He was happy when he wasn't being run by his fear. He liked what he was doing now. Knowing this, Haw didn't feel weak as he did when he stayed in Cheese Station C with no cheese. Just realizing he was not letting his fear stop him and knowing that he had taken a new direction nourished him and gave him strength. So it sounds like trying something new and facing your fears actually gives you strength. Of course it does. I know that it does. Now he felt that it was just a question of time before he found what he needed. In fact, he sensed he had already found what he was looking for. He smiled as he realized he didn't find any cheese. How did he find what he was looking for? It is safer to search in the maze that remain in a cheeseless It is safer to search in the maze than remain in a cheeseless situation. Haw realized again, as he had done once before, that what you are afraid of is never as bad as what you imagine. The fear you let build up in your mind is worse than the situation that actually exists. He'd been so afraid of never finding new cheese that he didn't even want to start looking. But since starting his journey, he had found enough cheese in the corridors to keep him going. Now he looked forward to finding more. Just looking ahead was becoming exciting. So this new adventure becomes exciting, it sounds like. His old thinking had been clouded by his worries and fears. He used to think about not having enough cheese or not having it last as long as he wanted. He used to think about what could go wrong than what could go right. He used to think more about what could go wrong than what could go right. But he had changed in the days since he had left Cheese Station C. He used to believe that cheese should never be moved, and that change wasn't right. Now he realized that it was natural for change to continually occur, whether you expect it or not. Change could surprise you only if you didn't expect it and weren't looking for it. When he realized he changed his beliefs, he paused to write on the wall. What's he writing this time? Old beliefs do not lead you to new cheese. Very simple, very profound. Haw hadn't found any cheese yet, but as he ran through the maze, he thought about what he had already learned. Haw now realized that his new beliefs were encouraging new behaviors. His new beliefs were encouraging new behaviors. He was behaving differently than when he kept returning to the same cheeseless station. He knew that when you change what you believe, you change what you do. You can believe that a change will harm you and resist it, or you can believe that finding new cheese will help you and embrace the change. It all depends on what you choose to believe. He wrote on the wall. When you see that you can find and enjoy new cheese, you change your course. Haw knew he would be in better shape now if he had dealt with the change much sooner and left Cheese Station C earlier. He would feel stronger in body and spirit, and he could have coped better with the challenge of finding new cheese. In fact, he probably would have found it by now if he had expected change rather than wasting time denying that the change had already taken place. He used his imagination again and saw himself finding and savoring new cheese. He decided to proceed into the more unknown parts of the maze and found little bits of cheese here and there. Haw began to regain his strength and confidence. As he thought back on where he had come from, Haw was glad he had written on the wall many places. He trusted that it would serve as a marked trail for him to follow through the maze if he ever chose to leave Cheese Station C. Haw just hoped he was heading in the right direction. He thought about the possibility that Hem would read the handwriting on the wall and find his way. He wrote on the wall he had been thinking about for some time. He wrote on the wall what he had been thinking about for some time. Noticing small changes early helps you adapt to the bigger changes that are to come. So learning these skills to adapt, to recognize change, to use our five senses to see that change is coming, what that does is it helps us prepare for change the next time and be better prepared for it the next time and the next time. So those are good things. By now, Haw had let go of the past and was adapting to the present. He continued to run through the maze with greater strength and speed. And before long, it happened. When it seemed like he had been in the maze forever, his journey, or at least this part of his journey, ended quickly and happily. Haw proceeded along a corridor that was new to him, rounded a corner, and found new cheese at Cheese Station N. When he went inside, he was startled by what he saw. Piled high everywhere was the greatest supply of cheese he had ever seen. He didn't recognize all that he saw, as some kinds of cheese were new to him. Then he wondered for a moment whether it was real or just his imagination, until he saw his friends Sniff and Scurry. Of course, Sniff welcomed Haw with a nod of his head, and Scurry waved his paw. Their little fat bellies showed that they had been here for some time. Haw quickly said his hellos and soon took bites of every one of his favorite cheeses. He pulled off his shoes, tied the laces together, and hung them around his neck in case he needed them again. Sniff and Scurry laughed. They nodded their heads in admiration. Then Haw jumped into the new cheese. When he had eaten his fill, he lifted a piece of fresh cheese and made a toast. Hooray for change! As Haw enjoyed the new cheese, he reflected on what he had learned. He realized that when he had been afraid to change, he had been holding on to the illusion of old cheese that was no longer there. So what was it that made him change? Was it the fear of starving to death? Haw smiled as he thought it certainly helped. Then he laughed and realized that he had started to change as soon as he had learned to laugh at himself and at what he had been doing all along. He realized the fastest way to change is to laugh at your own folly. Then you can let go and quickly move on. Xfinity, what's going on? Seriously, what's going on with my signal? He knew he had learned something useful about moving on from his mice friend Sniff and Scurry. They kept life simple. They didn't overanalyze or overcomplicate things. When the situation changed and the cheese had been moved, they changed and moved with the cheese. He would remember that. Haw had used his wonderful brain to do what little people do better than mice. He envisioned himself in realistic detail finding something better, much better. So the mice had the five senses, the humans had the brains, right? The little people had the brains, but they were using the brains to overanalyze things. And what they're saying is that they should have been using their brains in order to create pictures of where they wanted to be and where he wanted to go. He reflected on the mistakes he had made in the past and used them to plan for his future. He knew that you could learn to deal with change. You could be more aware of the need to keep things simple, be flexible, and move quickly. You did not need to overcomplicate matters or confuse yourself with fearful beliefs. You could notice when the little changes began so that you would be better prepared for the big change that might come. He knew he needed to adapt faster, for if you do not adapt in time, you might as well not adapt at all. Well, I don't know. Well, yeah, if you don't adapt in time, he just adapted, it seems like, in the nick of time. What happened to him? He had to admit that the biggest inhibitor to the change lies within yourself and that nothing gets better until you change. Perhaps most importantly, he realized that there is always new cheese out there, whether you know it at the time or not, and that you are rewarded with it when you go past your fear and enjoy the adventure. He knew some fear would be respected, as it can keep you out of real danger. But he realized most of his fears were irrational and had kept him from changing when he needed to. He didn't like it at the time, but he knew that the change had turned out to be a blessing in disguise as it led him to find better cheese. He had even found a better part of himself. As Haw recalled what he had learned, he thought about his friend Hem. He wondered if Hem had read any of the sayings Haw had written on the wall at Cheese Station C and throughout the maze. Had Hem ever decided to let go and move on? Had he ever entered the maze and discovered what could make his life better? Or was Hem still hemmed in because he would not change? Haw thought about going back again to Cheese Station C to see if he could find Hem, assuming that Haw could find his way back there. If he found Hem, he thought he might be able to show him how to get out of his predicament, but Haw realized that he had already tried to get his friend to change. Hem had to find his own way, beyond his comforts and past his fear. No one else could do that for him or talk him into it. He somehow had to see the advantage of changing himself. He had to believe that he could change. He had to believe that changing and turning into his fears would have a payoff. He had to believe that. Haw knew he had left a trail for him and that he could find his way if he could just read the handwriting on the wall. He went over and wrote down a summary of what he had learned on the largest wall of Cheese Station N. He drew a large piece of cheese around all the insights he had become aware of and smiled as he looked at what he had learned. And so, I don't think I put that down there. I didn't. Change happens. They keep moving the cheese. Anticipate the change. Get ready for the cheese to move. Monitor change. Smell the cheese often so you know when it is getting old. Adapt to change quickly. The quicker you let go of old cheese, the sooner you can enjoy new cheese. change, move with the cheese, enjoy change, savor the adventure and enjoy the taste of new cheese. Be ready to change quickly and enjoy it again and again. They keep moving the cheese. Haw realized how far he had come since he had been with him in Cheese Station C, but knew it would be easy for him to slip back if he got too comfortable. So each day he inspected Cheese Station N, using his senses to see what the condition of his cheese was. He was getting to do whatever he could to avoid being surprised by unexpected change. While Haw still had a great supply of cheese, he often went into the maze and explored new areas to stay in touch with what was happening around him. He knew it was safer to be aware of his real choices than to isolate himself in his comfort zone. Then Haw heard what he thought was the sound of movement out in the maze. As the noise grew louder, he realized that someone was coming. Could it be him that was arriving? Was he about to turn the corner? Haw said a little prayer and hoped, as he had many times before, that maybe at last his friend was finally able to move with the cheese. Well, I know it makes me sad if I think that Hem did not make it out of there. I know that makes me sad. So I have a mental representation in my head that Hem made it out of there and found his buddy Haw. That's the mental representation. That's the mental representation I'm making in my head. Okay, we are done for the day. No, we have till 9:30 to go. Okay, but I want to take a little break. I just finished reading that story and I'm going to pull up some questions for you here. So, but I'm going to take a 5-minute break. So 5 minutes and I will be back. I'm going to go ahead. Oh, here in the I have got a PowerPoint that you can find in LinkedIn. Again, I'm going to try and get this all up on my website this weekend, which is www.healthymindbodyspirit.net. All right. But in that, if you go to LinkedIn and you look for me, my name, my company name, if you look for me on LinkedIn, you can find the packet of slides that I have for you. And in that packet of slides is that Who Moved My Cheese. I think I actually have it someplace else too. Right side up and fitting the whole entire page. So it fits the whole entire page. It looks better and it's right side up for you. And you can do a word search for Who Moved My Cheese. So that's an activity that maybe you might want to do when you are off for the next 4 days. All right, so here are some questions, and I'm going to take a 5-minute break and then probably come back and say almost goodbye. But let's start taking a look at some of the questions, and that's what I'll leave up for you.